Sasha Alenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. Today's Class 1 railroads are carrying too little of the country's freight. That is not a controversial statement. And on Reconnect America, we've been exploring why that is and what can be done about it. In particular, we've been focused on how some pretty foundational transformations in our national approach to rail policy, starting in 1970 and culminating with the Deregulatory Staggers Act in 1980, opened the door for freight rail transport to become an extractive industry, one vulnerable to the predations of Wall Street greed and its tendency to chase short-term profit at the expense of longer-term growth, or even, as we have seen over the past 20 years, at the expense of maintaining current levels of service. Needless to say, there are many different ways to connect the dots between the deregulation that occurred in that period and the present predicament. And in fairness, not everybody does see such a direct relationship between the two. There are also, of course, just as many ways to imagine a path forward, from public ownership of the whole system, or public ownership of just the tracks, creating an open access steel interstate, to a return to the earlier regulatory regime that presided over most of the 20th century, to simply waiting to see if the market will sort itself out, at the risk of driving the industry into the ground first. Among the many voices on this issue, one that I find particularly balanced, nuanced, and insightful is that of Byron Porter. A former grain shipper himself, Byron is the founder and CEO of Hum Industrial Technology, which makes devices geared toward making the rail industry safer and helping it serve its customers better. He is also the author and host of a blog and podcast on Substack called The Pacific, where he gives his take on the most pressing issues in the rail industry. We'll put a link in the show notes. Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer interviewed Byron at the beginning of August. And if I were to attempt to extrapolate from that conversation a central thesis, it would be this: that the Staggers Act, which deregulated the railroad industry in 1980, though necessary and even beneficial for both railroads and their customers in the first few decades after its passage, nonetheless contained the seeds of the undoing of those very benefits, as far as shippers and the public are concerned. Deregulation allowed for lower rates and higher volumes for the first 25 years, but the massive consolidation of the industry through which, in part, it achieved these gains also concentrated market power. And about 20 years ago, railroads started using that leverage to turn up the dial on rates and to turn away all but the most profitable freight. The balance between growth and profitability shifted almost exclusively to the latter, as activist investors began showing up to the party. Railroad managers are only doing what their shareholders expect of them, and those expectations are in turn circumscribed by what is legally permitted. It is therefore time for lawmakers and regulators to try something new. And with the legitimacy, independence, and jurisdiction of the Surface Transportation Board under ever greater threat as it faces down a merger of historic proportions, this could be the last chance, for the STB at least, to take meaningful action for a long time to come.
So it's great to be here with Byron Porter. Byron is an entrepreneur, an engineer, and a self-taught, I guess, historian, because what I read in his posts is rich history, a rich understanding of not just rail history, but U.S. history. And so it's an honor, Byron, to be able to hang out with you. And I love for you to share a little bit more about yourself and what brought you into the realm of rail.
Yeah, appreciate that, Bill. Thanks for letting me come and pontificate. I think my wife and others are tired of hearing me, so always good to find new audience for this. So my background, I'm an engineer. I studied chemical engineering at BYU back in the day. I'm originally from the Midwest, and despite my best efforts, I made it back home, my hometown, to work at the hometown company, ADM, Archer Daniels Midland. It was an awesome job. I loved working there, eventually as an engineering superintendent. So I kind of oversaw all the capital project work, oversaw all our on-site contractors and process improvements. And really more of my experience came from process systems and maintenance and plant work. I did switch rail cars, load, unload rail cars, and got involved in some of that. But that was a really small part of my time at ADM. I left ADM 2018, kind of looking for the next big challenge, and decided to go to business school and get my MBA here in St. Louis at WashU. And as part of that, all the experience of working with rail and all the issues of the rail were kind of in the back of my head. I had no intention of going the entrepreneurial route, but I thought I'd try it out from some of the advice of one of our now board members who was living back in Illinois with me, kind of encouraged me to go with this path. Got up to speed on sensor technology, IoT stuff, and really saw the opportunity in the rail space to really upgrade the underlying data infrastructure and take some outdated technology and push it into the next generation to do all the things that I wish we had when I was a rail shipper to solve some of the chronic issues in the rail industry and with rail service. So that kind of is how I got started with Hum. So I spent several years at ADM working from the rail shipper side, and then now on the technology service provider side to try to move the industry forward with better visibility tools. No more East Palestines with our predictive bearing sensor. And so we put a lot of sensors on the rail car, and we try to marry that with some of the latest in data analytics and such to really improve the rail service, rail system. So we work across all different parts of the rail industry, and that's led me to writing a lot, podcasting, speaking. I believe that a healthy rail industry is a healthy hum, our business. So I try to point out issues that I see and propose solutions where I think they could fit. So that's led me to spend a lot of time in DC, a lot of time reading a bunch of old rail history books, and a lot of time with railroads and shippers alike. So I come at it from a shipper side, but I try to take a holistic perspective and take what the history books have taught us to improve the system going forward.
You combine both being an entrepreneur and also being a thought leader in this space. And I think that's really fascinating. And I can relate to the importance of understanding the history in order to understand the present. So maybe I'd invite you to speak a little bit to the history as you see it of the US rail system, however you'd like to frame it, but perhaps in terms of the impulse towards consolidation and mergers and acquisitions as part of the story.
Oh, that's an interesting take. Yeah. So if we go back to the beginnings, right, they say that Baltimore and Ohio was the first railroad back in the day, 1827. So we're coming up on 200 years now. It's all about trying to get the lowest cost of transportation to move goods to market. That's the whole point of rail. That's the whole point of a freight system. And honestly, and I can elaborate on this more, that's what I feel the regulatory focus needs to be is how do you reduce the cost of transportation as low as possible? I think that's going to unlock the biggest benefits to the economy. So 1827, entrepreneurs are starting to lay rail on the ground. It's relatively new. Britain comes out with steam locomotive technology that's quickly adopted over here. And then you start to see different rail lines that get put up. So the great era of rail expansion was probably 1840s to 1880s or so. And that's where very much entrepreneurial, like you see in a lot of young industries, a lot of capital, especially from Europe, comes over. They start laying track. They have all these visions, and you see a lot of rail names like the Missouri Pacific or the Union Pacific. This kind of expansionist idea, like we're going to go build all the way to the Pacific, and so that really kind of helped a young nation that was growing, especially that was largely agriculturally based, being able to get grain to market more cheaply and easily. Around 1827 was kind of Erie Canal time frame and using waterways. So it then quickly became more competitive to put it on rail than put it on water. And I think this is probably before it became really centered in the Mississippi River Basin, which is probably one of America's greatest strategic assets. And that's because it lowers the cost of moving freight by using the waterway. So railroads start getting built out. But then, as often happens, you have this cycle, a lot of excitement, and then you have a lot of overcapacity. Rail doesn't make money unless it hits a certain scale. The cost of capital, the cost of ballast, of rail, of locomotives, equipment, it is a very capital intensive industry. And it's not something like software where you can have two guys in a garage making millions of dollars because they have zero marginal cost. It's something that has very high marginal cost. And so you have to have a certain scale for it to make sense. And so when you have all this overbuilt capacity, And you had a lot of, this was in an era, especially into the Gilded Age, an era with no financial regulation or controls. And so a lot of swindling and a lot of, charlatans out there that would build a competing railroad just to sell it to another guy and make a quick buck on it, even though it ultimately was a failed venture to start. So a lot of people are losing money all over the place on this. The ups and downs of the rail cycle really contributed to some of the many financial panics and early depressions in the second half of the 19th century. So it's chaos until there does start to become some consolidation, right? You have people like Vanderbilt with the New York Central, the Penn Railroad, Missouri Pacific and Gould, and then much later on, James J. Hill and the Great Northern. You start to then see more of a structure like what we're more used to, where you have several hundred miles, you have much more consolidation and less competition. And JP Morgan, who was really kind of instrumental behind the scenes in a lot of this, he was the one that really kind of pushed the industry to consolidate because it was just killing everybody. Margins are in the toilet. Nobody's making money. Everybody's losing it. It's leading to all these financial issues. And so this was basically what he did during his career, was continually get industries to consolidate to some kind of stability so people could actually make money. You could get returns on capital and the like. And so he was a big proponent of that. Now, in that day, it was the trust. You had trusts like Standard Oil, like US Steel, was a Morgan creation, and trying to create a railroad trust. And it was really a cartel to control all the pricing and everything, right? So again, seems like a bunch of scoundrels compared to our day and age and how we view the financial system. But that's how it was. So it wasn't until the 1880s, 1890s, you really started to have a little more stability in the rail system. At the same time, through that period, rails really helped to build the production capacity of the United States. Very high tariffs, very attractive investment opportunities brought capital in. Rails really kind of made the US what it was. And the key inflection point then comes when Teddy Roosevelt takes office as a trust buster. And he really sets his sights on the rail industry and on Morgan and going after these guys. I should even say before then, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, the predecessor to the STB that regulates railroad commerce today, a lot of it came from what was called the Grange, which was agricultural shippers really got together and said, hey, these railroads are crooks. I now only have one railroad to serve my needs, and they're raising rates, and I got no say over this. And so that found kind of a welcome audience in Washington, and very early rail reform was pushed in 1885 or so, that time frame.
I think it's interesting because you've identified already two competing forces, the force of unregulated capital, but unregulated capital that was actually eating itself. Our friend Philip Longman reminds us of the term ruinous competition. So I think that ruinous competition is kind of what you were just referring to, that JP Morgan was warning against. The regulatory structure seems to be a response both to the public concerns of the Grange movement, et cetera, but also a concern about ruinous competition and the railroads eating their own, if you will. Is that accurate? Yeah, to say that those are two forces that are already at play at that time, and government is playing an intermediary role in between those two forces, but for the benefit of all.
What's different about the rail industry than almost any other industry is the scale of it. So you have, like you point out, you have at the Grange, you've got a lot of voters, a lot of constituents, a vast swath of America that is going to attract attention from Washington, right? And then you have capital and you have these large railroad companies that had to scale and get large enough to actually make money so they could reinvest in infrastructure and still get a profit on the end of it. There was nothing like this before the railroads, nothing of this scale. And so there was also evidenced by the first organized labor movement really in the US, where railroad employees felt like they weren't well represented and their interests weren't considered by management, by capital. So you have these very large organizations that are now suddenly all competing, and you have the inherent necessity for rail to continue the growth of this young nation and its economy. So yeah, you have all these different factors that are starting to weigh in here. So, it's akin to like the internet in some respects, but even then, I don't think the internet reached the same magnitude and impact to society that rail did, which seems crazy to say, but I think that's some of the reasons why. So, a lot of inherent tension with it. It was always going to draw regulatory scrutiny. You start to see the first efforts to regulate the railroads in the 1880s with the ICC coming to pass, but it doesn't really gain any power until many years later. The railroad's power isn't curbed until you start to get into Teddy Roosevelt and the trust busters. And at that time, that really breaks the railroads. I call it like the lost century. Pretty much from that time when Morgan, Hill, they were trying to do some huge rail merger, trying to lock up competition through consolidation. When it got to that point, the Supreme Court ruled on the back of antitrust legislation that this was a trust and it needed to be broken up, and they proceeded to do so. Very soon after that, it goes into World War One. The railroads are just an utter mess. The U.S. government actually takes over the rail system to try and get it to operate efficiently for the needs of the war. And there was a lot of different attempts on trying to remake the rail industry coming out of World War One. Some folks wanted to nationalize the rail system. There really wasn't an appetite to do that in Congress at the time or with the president, I don't believe. And so they had different plans that were put forward, like, having rail labor on the board of some of these railroads and a lot of different things that are still interesting and relevant today in how you look at solving issues. But from that time on, the ICC finally has power. It's regulating rates, and you start to see rail kind of decline going up into World War II. I think I got a bump from that, but then afterwards, trucking starts to take off, and it's the beginning of the end. That brings us to the 60s and especially the bankruptcy of the Penn Central Railroad in 1970, which was the largest bankruptcy up until Enron many decades later. That sets us for this next era of reform that took a decade and brought about several key pieces of legislation, including the Staggers Act that we live under today. But it wasn't that regulators sat idly by, although some may say, yeah, they should have done more and they didn't, while railroads were getting eviscerated by trucking and then later by containers and such. I think there's probably some truth to that, but there's a lot of different attempts made to correct the situation. You had this rail system, this network that was built out in the 19th century. Now you're in the mid 20th century and it doesn't meet the needs, right? There's a rail historian called Richard Saunders Jr. He's a lot of great books. I really like how he describes it. He calls it the weak road, strong road problem. Regulators tried to go and use mergers to try and fix some of these issues by pairing up a weak railroad and a strong railroad. Well, their attempts at doing that, while noble, it actually took a very bad railroad and an okay railroad and made them both mostly bad railroads. They saddled them with more debt. You still had the same issues with the industry and the market changing, factories closing down, new factories set up. Rail is a very static system. It can't change to match the economy as quickly as it needs to sometimes. So they tried all these different combinations and just nothing really worked. Even Penn Railroad and New York Central combining in 1968 was an attempt to try and solve issues that couldn't be solved by consolidation. That didn't really fix the underlying problem. So that takes us into the era of the 1970s of reform. And if I can try as concisely as possible, I think the few key issues that the railroads were facing in the bankruptcy of Penn Central was one, passenger rail. They were still in charge of delivering passengers. And that was a huge, like, nobody makes money on passenger rail in the entire world. It has to be subsidized for it to survive, and it wasn't. So railroads are dying that way. The second one was capped rates. They couldn't engage in private contracts. They couldn't match rates to market needs. So they were losing a ton of money that way. Those were two of the big ones. So then you start to see legislation come through, like the 3 Rs or the 4 Rs in 1974, 76, right?
73 and 76, I think. Yeah. Something
Yeah.
like
So
that.
you create Amtrak and you have a nationalized passenger rail system, which is great. Okay. Now you take that stone off the neck of the railroads so they can breathe again. And then you start to push about more reforms that ultimately come about in the Staggers Act, right? Oh, I guess the last issue is railroads couldn't merge. They couldn't consolidate when they needed to. It was a lot of matchmaking by the government that didn't work very well, right? So Staggers was important in that it unlocked consolidation in the industry to where you could take care of a lot of these issues. You could shed lines that you didn't want to have anymore. It wasn't just government kind of stipulated and you don't have to deal with the passengers anymore. Now you could enter into private contracts. So very, very key regulations that were very much needed.
And yet simultaneously, in terms of lowering the cost of transportation, the federal government have been since maybe 1920, but dramatically since 1950, subsidizing trucking, subsidizing the competition. So you have an open access public infrastructure that is not putting a true cost on trucking, and it's forcing rail to compete with that mode of land transportation. Is that also fair to add to the equation?
I push back on a lot of it, though. I think that's a lot of belly aching by railroads over, oh, we're private, all our money's private investment and such. And it's true, but they get a lot of government subsidies at the same time as well.
Right.
And maybe this is more modern and less applicable to that era. The Chrissy program, I don't know if the short line industry would survive without the Chrissy program. So, like, you get a lot of handouts too, guys. Like, don't pretend like you're completely independent. You do put a lot of money of your own capital into it, but you also make a ton of money too. So, trucks, you could say they pay for some of it in fuel tax, but no, the wear and tear of trucks on the nation's infrastructure and the sheer cost of that is insane. And that's why I've always advocated from a national perspective, like freight transportation policy should be rail first, truck second, or in some cases, water first, rail and truck second. But we get more bang for the buck and we have less potholes on the highway, less bridges with corroded steel that are falling down and don't have to pay as much capital. We can extend the life of those public infrastructure assets with more trucks that we take off of the roads, better for the environment and all the above. So if we realigned around some of those key facts, that would be net positive for the country.
Right. So at the STB, we both gave testimony there. I got a few minutes and, I've been pretty fascinated with the external costs of trucking relative to rail, right? I'm looking at the Congressional Budget Office numbers and the ratio of 8 to 1. The society's paying for trucking. We're artificially making the cost of that mode of transportation low by not figuring in how for that to pay its fair share. I'm not trying to make excuses for the railroads at all. They've had so many interventions that I think it's actually a history of intervention. I would love to do a timeline of the kinds of interventions that the railroads have gotten from their birth. If you think about the land grants, and then you think about the watered down stocks and the things you referred to of all these market manipulations, the World War I harmonizing the system at the expense of the taxpayers. And I think I'm barely probably scratching the surface. And then each consolidation feels like a way of squeezing more life and resilience out of a system that has, I would venture to say, a fatal flaw of actually relying on private capital to sustain national infrastructure. I think maybe you and I differ there, but I think it's something that really ought to be teased out. I mean, you speak to the importance of like Europe and then the US subsidizing passenger rail because it was a burden for the freight railroads and because it serves a public good. It makes sense. Nobody in the world relies on their passenger system to turn a profit. A public good is also served by a great rail system that serves freight. So anyway, it's just something that I'm pondering these days. I just feel like there's a series of ways that we're trying to make this private infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, be able to sustain itself. And it's a history of interventions, it's a history of consolidations, and we're still not sure that it's actually serving the public needs. Actually, what we're sure of is that it's not adequately serving the public interests.
There's been many attempts made over the years to try and do this, but you have these very competing, mostly competitive, sometimes complementary interests of where you need to have capital and you need to have enough attractive returns to attract the capital, but you have to get to such a scale for it to make money, right? At the same time, you also have a national infrastructure, as you say, that was built to serve both passenger and freight, but primarily serving freight today. How do you, on a private infrastructure, how do you give access to competing interests in terms of passenger transit? Because those two don't mix. And you see all the issues with Amtrak and the railroads. I think Norfolk Southern was the latest to kind of draw attention to not giving Amtrak the precedence that it was deserved. And how do you resolve all these tensions? It's very difficult. So there's no wonder that the government has again and again over time weighed in on this and is doing so again with the latest, UPNS merger announcement. It's kind of always going to be this way with rail, I think. I don't know if there's any other way around it. And maybe you get to that with infrastructure and you got this messy public private model of interest and investment. Staggers was absolutely necessary. It was a godsend. It was what the industry needed at the time. And I think those who worked on the era of reform in the 1970s did a phenomenal job of trying to get it, from Nixon through Carter and then eventually into Reagan era, cleaning up the ends of it. So there's no great solution to a lot of this, but at least there's kind of fundamentals and principles that we have to guide us along the way.
Right. And so you've identified that you think that staggers was very important and essential, but that it sort of lost its relevance over the last 20 to 30 years. So could you take us through that transition of staggers being the right answer to the problem to then being an inadequate response to the current reality?
Yeah, I think by many measures, Staggers was a resounding success the 20 years after it was passed, 20, 25 years after it was passed. You allowed the industry to consolidate and to shed lines that were unprofitable. You created the short line industry essentially, an explosion of these abandoned lines taken over by entrepreneurs. Take Iowa Northern and the Sabin family, an old, I think it was a Chicago Northwestern line that was just a complete disaster in terms of upkeep and maintenance. And then they turned it into something that they sold for quite a bit of money to Canadian National that had economic value, right? It's great. We need to have a lot of those kind of stories, right? So it created this mechanism to have that. And in private contracts, of being able to apply the appropriate rate to the contracted service, I think is important. That gives you the flexibility to move up and down with the market as needed. And at the time of Staggers, this was still post Penn Central bankruptcy. And the question is, just like in World War One, should the US nationalize the rail system? The regulators, those in power at the time, said, no, we don't really want to do this. Didn't have the appetite for it, right? It's very deregulatory regime under the Carter administration, especially. And so it was all about the financial viability and health of the railroads. Are they going to survive with operating margins of like 80, 90, 95 plus percent? Okay. So all these changes come about. You start to have consolidation in the industry. That unlocks scale economies. So the railroads are much healthier. That takes us to, I put it around 2001 to 2004. The last mergers, Lyndon Morgan said, stop it, no more. We're going to raise that bar for having to allow you to merge because I think it's the tendency of capital to merge and consolidate ad infinitum until it runs into a brick wall. So you're always going to have financial interest pushing towards that because of scale economies in a business like this. And that's kind of the next unlock. So we get to the point where they've merged, they've consolidated, they've integrated. The UPSP left a bad taste in a lot of folks' mouths, but it's done. 2004, you start to see this inflection point. You start to see a change then in the approach to the railroads. About the same time, Hunter Harrison is rolling over at CN, I believe, implementing precision scheduled railroading. He started with IC in the 90s and kind of more of a let's focus on consolidating the gains we have, right? We can't grow from merging, so let's consolidate gains. And this has always been my main thesis, and any criticism of the current industry is that this is just kind of business strategy in general. You can either grow or you can be more profitable. You can't do both at the same time. They require different inputs, they require different incentives. So the rail industry went from a growth mindset to a profitability one, right? Let's cut costs, let's consolidate, let's rationalize the infrastructure we have now that we've combined everything. Do we have two locomotives in this place? We need one locomotive. Do we have two guys and we need one over here, right? That same kind of math. At the same time, let's start to go for profitability. Can we put a 10% rate increase on this ship or are they going to stick around? So you really start to see rail rates really change and grow much more quickly post 2004 than you see pre 2004. And one of the interesting things, and I always highlight this, that you see in any kind of postmortem of the Staggers Act, they usually are dated around 2008, 2010, and they say, like, look at all these great things that happened, right? Rail rates came down. Well, at the tail end of those graphs, there's always like post 2004 starting to come up. And I'd love to, I've never taken the time to do this, but go back and see, like, all right, let's see since 2005, like, does that still climb? And like, is it still, we hit the global minima now? Are we past that? And that's really what I think the story of the last 20 years has been. The data clearly shows rail rates have gone this and rail volumes have gone that. And it's like basic stuff, right? If you increase rates, eventually demand in the market's going to leave. And it's done that. And what's interesting too is that in each recessionary period, it's taken a step change down to where we are at today with far lower volumes than from the peak of 2006. A lot of that from coal, sure, but that's not the whole story here. You can't look at that and say, oh, it's just because coal is exiting the market. That's not the case.
Right. So you characterize this consolidation as inorganic growth, and you encourage organic growth. Am I getting that correct? Can you differentiate between organic and inorganic?
Well, stepping outside the rail industry and just looking at it from a business fundamentals perspective, yes, you have two options. You have organic growth. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to employ more salespeople, I'm going to have more competitive product offerings and invest in R&D, and I'm going to do things my competitors can't. I'm going to grow internally with my own business. Or I can go inorganic growth and I can buy another business. I can use merger and acquisition as a tool to grow my business. Generally, you see corporations, when they get large enough, they can't grow organically to where it moves the needle. And it's going to show up in, public companies, especially, it's going to show up in EPS, earnings per share growth. It's going to show up in some of the metrics that Wall Street analysts and shareholders are really wanting to. So it's not going to hit the benchmark. So what they have to do to really move the needle is inorganic growth. They got to go out and buy another company. They got to be CP going out and buy KCS. That's a step change for them. They're able to unlock a lot of new things that way. They're going to be eating off of that acquisition for many years to come. I think there's a lot more that the rail industry could do today organically that would not require inorganic growth. However, my contention is they don't know how to do that. That knowledge and skill set left their organizations. It was driven out because a completely different mindset was rewarded and promoted with internally, and everyone else who had the organic growth mindset got frustrated and left.
Right. And I feel like this is where the role of the short lines maybe comes in. And I think that you emphasize how important the skill set that is still within the short lines for attracting customers and competing on service instead of profiting from reducing access or relying on reduced access. Going back to the Staggers Act and the ability that allowed the railroads to sort of spin off these unprofitable branch lines that they would have been happy to abandon. Could you speak more to the growth of the short lines from that? Like, I think they had 8,000 miles of track, and then now they've got 45,000 miles of track. What is the role of the short lines in your perspective? And perhaps how has it changed from being just a spin-off thing to now being potentially the seeds for organic growth?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. I've been writing more about that this year in short lines. So let me see if I can consolidate into three main points. One of which is my framework for how I view the ideal state of the industry and the role short lines play in that. Two, how short lines really have very little power in the grand scheme of things. And they're really held back in their ability to grow organically through things like paper barriers with their lease agreements on their line leases from the class ones.
Right.
And then the third one being, I don't see a lot of people paying attention to this, but where the shoreline industry today is not the shoreline industry of yesterday. And it's very quickly becoming something much different. And especially if we go forward in my framework, that we might run into more problems in the future we hadn't taken into account. So start with my framework, how I view the world. The way I see the most ideal state of the rail industry is by splitting class one and short lines into wholesale versus retail. I am in favor of this rail merger, the UPNS one that's been proposed, and then the subsequent BNSF CSX one that would likely follow, if it could help us get the industry to this state. Class ones are the interstate highway system. They offer a one wholesale price to customers who come on based on the stretch of road they're going to be occupying or the service that they're provided. They can go do what they do best: scale, hook and haul, deploy capital efficiently at scale for maintenance of infrastructure and equipment. The short lines then would be the retail, the mom and pops, the local grocer. They're the ones that actually have boots on the ground in the places where their shippers are, their customers are, that can bring the plate of sandwiches in the holidays and ask how the kids are doing. Actually have someone on the ground that you can go and talk to when you have an issue that arises. They can do pre-blocking for the class one superhighway. and they can do all the local yard service. They can go and serve local yards for the different customers. That's the retail model. And they're very good at that. And the class ones are very good at hook and haul. They don't mix, right? The class ones do not do well with local service. That's why these abandoned lines turning into short lines makes a ton of sense. That's the first point. The second point, short lines are really handicapped by their line agreements because many of them are embedded with paper barriers, meaning it is prohibitively expensive for me to offer my customer the ability to go to a competing class one railroad because, say, I've got a lease from UP, they've made it so I can't access BNSF. So UP has captive traffic. At the same time, my UP landlord is unwilling to entertain any idea of new business unless it hits this threshold. Therefore, I'm losing business and I cannot grow because, again, that profitability focused railroad is now saying, nope, it's got to be this much per car for me to actually get interested in it. This could be very meaningful growth added up. This is meaningful growth for the short line, but the class one is unable to access it because they aren't able to think outside of a profitability mindset. Okay, that's a big issue in the rail industry. A lot of cases of that. I wrote a big article about paper barriers, talked to Chuck Baker about this same thing as well.
Okay, but this power differential. One thing I was struck by the STB is the chair asks, "Oh, how's it going with the relationship with the class ones?" It's like, what the hell does he expect them to say? To me, it was obvious that they couldn't actually tell the truth because they could be retaliated against by their host railroad. That dependency, that power differential. Could you speak a little bit more about that? This practice of controlling a single mile of track. And maybe for people who aren't familiar with this stuff, it would be handy to know that these short line railroads, they don't have a choice of who they're going to connect with. They can only connect with the principal railroad most of the time, right?
I mean, it does feel like the schoolyard bully beating up on the kindergartners almost, right? Like the poor shorelines feel like there's not a lot we can do here. Our hands are tied. And the class one, sometimes it's like, man, you guys are stupid about this. Like taking out 1 mile of track so that your competitor can't interchange, and other goofy stuff they do. But it's all about protecting the network, right? Defending the franchise. Well, and I say this in jest because you can't fault them at the same time because they are playing to their incentives, right? Everybody's going to look out for themselves. What they don't see and what they aren't necessarily rewarded by immediately is that if everybody just put the guns down and we get out of this Mexican standoff here, the industry would be healthier as a whole if we allowed for as many carloads to come into the network as possible, even if it doesn't benefit you personally today. And I've encouraged, folks in the C suites of the class ones, when I talk with some of them, like do some horse trading, right? Give your competitor 3 short lines and you get 3 of their short lines, access to them. And I think they're certainly more open minded today than they have been in the past. I think that they recognize some of this. Hopefully, they can do some of these deals where everybody wins in the end on the global scale. And maybe on the micro scale, you lose out here, but you win somewhere else, right?
Right. I want to make sure that we touch on the fact that the courts just vacated this issue of reciprocal switching. Now, for me, this idea that shippers could go to a different railroad and that railroad could get access to track that it didn't have trackage rights on necessarily in order to provide them service, that was potentially an opening. Now, of course, that was very limited. It was limited to non-exempted commodities, which for those who don't know what that is, that's currently wheat, coal, crude oil, and some hazardous chemicals, meaning that it was irrelevant for a lot of commodities. It wasn't going to help everybody, but it would seem like it was a place to start from. So if you could revoke exemptions and expand reciprocal switching to short line railroads, you'd start to have the appearances of a more open access system that would force the railroads, yes, to compete with each other and to compete with some trucking, because you have 1 trillion ton miles practically of long haul trucking that's costing society a great deal. But reciprocal switching early July was taken away as a tool from the Surface Transportation Board. So your call for a new Staggers Act seems to me wants to institutionalize something like reciprocal switching in a broader sense. Could you speak to what you think the new Staggers Act would have in it?
Yeah, I'm advocating for a new regulatory regime because I feel that the current guardrails are completely broken in this existing one. And so the railroads can't help but be indulged in their worst behaviors. The shippers have no relief. The market dominance by these ultra consolidated railroads has no check. And so we need new kind of structure in place, new statutory authority given to the STB to regulate some of these things. Reciprocal switching as a tool, I don't know that it really moves the needle for most commodities and most groups. I just don't know to what extent even Texas Gulf Coast, that's a very critical area for a lot of chemical, petrochem, oil and gas, where maybe it is meaningful. But, I talk with a lot who don't have access to it and wouldn't have access to it. And in fact, on the reciprocal switching rule, I thought was very soft, at least from my experience as a shipper. It's like, come on, we had terrible service and we never would have triggered these. Like the bar was set far too high for anything to really happen. This is really just kind of done for show, but it doesn't really give the relief to shippers that's needed. So I don't have like a lot of great specifics on what it should be other than to say that a new regulatory regime should have tools that induce competition and allow for shippers to also get relief from lack of competition.
Byron, would that include revoking exemptions to service exemptions?
I honestly don't understand them. I'm just ignorant on that. I don't understand why you have these massive exemptions that wipe out most of the market because that also seems kind of stupid, but I just don't know enough about it to comment more intelligently on it though.
Sasha would love to hear from you more about the rate review process.
I'd like to see some rate review process. It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. It could be 10 years before you get a response out of the STB on some of this and some of the back and forth. It's like Bart Simpson going out to fight Mike Tyson. The railroads have gone through this so many times. And if you want to, as a shipper, want to go and access it, you got to pay for consultative help to get you through there because you've never done this before. You go on to a tariff rate, you're no longer on a contract rate. So now your rates are through the roof. So your boss is spitting mad at you. Maybe your business is impacted materially in a way that maybe you wouldn't even survive. You're going to deal with at least, if not direct, indirect retaliatory measure from a railroad. That is going to come back to the shipper in some form or fashion. So shippers don't do this. Now, I've known a shipper who has gone through and has gotten relief from it. They spent like $6 million doing that. I mean, for a shipper to be guilty until proven innocent, there is no rate relief currently. That's one of the biggest issues under this regulatory regime. There is no rate relief for shippers. So there's no check on increased market and pricing power by railroads.
Right. So I know our time with you is wrapping up. Don't want to miss the opportunity to get you to speak to the potential this merger between UP and Norfolk Southern potentially offers as a window for the kind of new regulatory regime that you're advocating for. It seems like this is a moment when a situation that felt quite static now feels dynamic. And we have an opportunity, both shippers and public interest groups, to negotiate a new regime that is both good for the long-term health of the railroads as well as the public interests and shippers' interests.
I'll give my 2 cents on this. I actually had a call earlier today with the Shipper Trade Association rep, and they asked me, "What do you think we should do?" And, I really kind of feel like this is like Avengers Endgame moment. Like, if you got anything to say, please speak up or forever hold your peace. This is it. And I know the STB feels that after their efforts at reciprocal switching or final offer rate review were rebuffed, they don't have power to do anything except when it comes to transactions. Now we have a transaction. So any changes that are going to be made, now's the time to make them. I think that this merger is going to come down to one thing, and that's the STB is going to ask for X, UP is going to, and NS are going to want to give up Y, and they have to decide if they want to cut deep enough to meet X. And it may come to the point where they're like, it just isn't worth it for us. We can't make this deal work. I think it's likely going to go through. The eternal optimist in me says, great, this is an opportunity for us to kind of move towards my framework of a balanced market where you have comparative advantages at play and shippers are benefiting from railroads can do line haul efficiently in the class ones and cheaply. And you have the short lines that can provide the white glove service locally. I don't know how you actually get there as part of that. I'm not smart enough to understand if that mechanism even exists through a merger review process. My hope is that we would get to that. The cynic in me, and the thing I think is much more likely, is that this gets approved without those many concessions that I would like to see. And we don't solve a lot of the underlying issues. The industry sees a short to midterm bump in growth and then continues on its downward decline forever. So until the boards decide to wake up and make a change on some of these things. The UPNS call was interesting in that Jim Venna, the UP CEO, I believe, said there are fewer than 20 customers that are going to go from two railroads down to one. This is truly end to end. And I think, that may very well be true. The problem is, and the problem for the STB is that the market imbalance is already occurred and they can't go relitigate the past necessarily. I don't know how successful they would be in trying to go and scraping back concessions from past mergers or things that should have been done in past mergers today. And I think the UP may have an argument to say, like, hey, what's done is done. We're offering something that's truly end to end and, is pro competition. We're not taking away from competition. You should consider our case on its merits today and forget about all the stuff in the past. And they may have legal basis for that. So I think there is a reality where they push through and they don't have to make the concessions that really reorient or rebalance the market. So I'm cynical on that last point. I'm hopeful on the first point, but we'll see where it lands.
Yeah. You did say something, you quipped in a recent article about physics doesn't lie.
I say that a lot. Yeah.
I love that, man, because that's for me why I question your assertion that railroads have to simply compete with each other and not with trucking. Because it seems like part of the potential of this merger is that it has the potential to compete with trucking, but how do we put the pedal to the metal so that it is actually competing with trucking? What are the details that would allow it to do that so that we are using the most efficient land-based transportation mode and we are lowering the cost, external costs and internal costs of shipping for shippers to increase prosperity and opportunity?
Well, you don't need a merger to compete with trucking. Railroads do not compete with trucking. And if they merge, they would still not compete with trucking. And it simply comes down to the fact that they are profitability, not growth focused, because they are not willing to loosen their margin requirements to compete with trucking. Now, I contend they would make more money having a smaller slice of a larger pie than continuing to have a larger slice of a shrinking pie. I think the numbers work out that way. But they've decided that they're not interested in competing with trucks. They lost the battle with trucks years ago. Now, if they were to merge, this merger doesn't unlock anything in a truck competition standpoint, other than I would say, and they brought this up on the call too, kind of the 1,000, 1,500 mile range. They might compete a little bit better in kind of the mid haul, but they're not going to go after the less than 500-mile places where they could do today. And I think through short lines, probably get some help in doing some of this stuff. So merger doesn't change any of this. I think if you really wanted to compete with trucks, you got to change out the C-suite. You got to change out senior management. You have to instill a completely different culture, completely different incentives, reward different behaviors. And it's akin, I think, to a revolution, not an evolution. And it's not something that CSX or others are really doing.
Well, I appreciate that. I do feel like it's the over 500 miles that concerns me most, that I think there's the most cost to society and also the most potential for rail to compete. And it troubles me that there isn't a clear path to getting that to happen. I hope that your less cynical side is correct and it ends up getting that wins the day,
I
right?
hope so too.
Cynicism is a hard place to be. It's not helpful. That cynical side of us, it can really paralyze our ability to imagine a future that our kids deserve. So if there's anything you'd like to say in closing, we really appreciate you taking this time. And I'm sorry we went over, but thank you.
No, that's all I got. You can read more of what I write at the Pacific. I don't post on LinkedIn as much as I used to, but I'll put some stuff out there and happy to hear alternative perspectives on my opinions, different takes. I only know about this much, so there's a lot more knowledge out there to be had with probably more sensible positions to take than mine.
Well, we think you're pretty sensible, and it is interesting to see the variety of perspectives. And it is, I've always been impressed by what a steep learning curve the railroad is. 10 years of climbing it, and I still feel like I'm hanging on by my fingernails. So I really appreciate all the work and insights that you bring, all the research you've done, and your generous sharing of your perspectives and your out of the box thinking. So Byron, thank you very much for hanging out with us.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time.
That was Hum Industrial Technology founder and CEO Byron Porter in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. You can find the show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.